All right, Mike. I appreciate you coming on, man. It's kind of funny that I think the first time we had a conversation was on my fly video, and I was out trying to chase the bonita, and I had a real issue. I had a Lamson at the time, and it was freezing up on me, and I ended up losing fish, yada, yada. You were like, we got to get out there and get some. So that's the first time we started talking, and I was immediately drawn to you because you have a history of fly fishing.
I do.
So I want to start by getting into the conversation of where are you from originally?
So I'm originally from the outside of Raleigh area. Grew up in the Smithfield, Selma, Fuquay, kind of moved around as a kid. And I moved in that area, and I found my way into the mountains as a young adult, fresh out of high school. So that's.
And when you moved to the mountains, was there an original goal, or were you what drew you to the mountains?
So my story is the biggest. My dad was a huge influence with me. He was always a big fly fisherman. He was always into fishing. The biggest thing I know, how to describe him was, those parents that always push their kids to do sports. My dad was like that, but with fishing. So my dad, he pushed me to be a big fisherman. And I found the love for it at a really young age. I had pictures of myself 3 years old with a fly rod in my hand. So that was pretty much my destiny of becoming a fishing guide. So from a young age, I probably figured out at 14 years old, I wanted to get out of high school and I wanted to becoming a fishing guide. And that's what I did.
What did your dad have you fishing for at an early age? If you remember it?
So I was really lucky to take trips with my dad to all kinds of different. They're originally from the Massachusetts area where they would have stocked ponds of trout, things of that nature. So when we would go see family, we'd go fish for stocked trout, and then back home, bass fishing, crappie fishing, things of that nature. And probably on a monthly basis, we would go up to the mountains of Boone, which is where I ended up, and go trout fishing. And that's where I found the love. And it was easy for me to fall in love with it. It's just beautiful up there. So
yeah, I think about me as a fly, I've gotten into fly fishing later in life, but I try to think about a 3-year-old. What size fly rod would you even be using at that age?
Honestly, I believe they were 9 foot, 9 foot 5 weights. That's what my dad always used for trout. I used that for trout as well. Even when I was guiding, I wouldn't use smaller rods for kids. Now, 3-year-olds, I would never guide 3-year-olds. That's too young. I would start, I recommend people to start their kids at 8 to 10. It's usually when they have the focus to be able to fly fish. And but yeah, full size, 9 foot rods.
That's cool. So you moved up to the Boone area, and you knew just from previous experience that you wanted to chase trout. What type of fish were you targeting? I know you said trout, but specific fish.
Mm-hmm. So I always loved wild trout, and specific brown trout are my favorite. They're the meanest trout per se. They like to eat big bugs, big bait fish patterns, flies, and they were always the most fun to fight. So that's what I look for, and specifically in small creeks is where I really like to go for them. I didn't like the big rivers. I really liked the areas that you could go out, hike into them and try to find a place that maybe someone hasn't fished in a long time.
Mm-hmm. What is the width of these creeks that you consider small?
I would probably say anywhere from 3 to 10 feet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really small.
Yeah, really, really small. So I would really like to, tiny. I've caught trout in ditches.
Oh, wow.
So I like the small stuff. Yeah.
And you say that you like to target those areas that other people aren't fishing. So I would assume that you have to spend a lot of time scouting in order to find these places.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I recommend people is Google Maps. It's a wonderful feature that we have to our disposal that our parents and our grandparents didn't. Google Maps is the best thing. Now, typically in the mountains, they don't have great topography maps. So really, you're only going to see a blue line on a map, and you have to actually physically go see that water in person. It's not, there's so much rhododendron and thick brush that you're not going to be able to see on that map the actual water. So I recommend going, pick a spot and just go explore and enjoy the, this most beautiful place on the East Coast, in my opinion.
And you would have to pick these areas based on access from the road.
Yes. So a lot of places, luckily in Boone, you can hop on the creek right from the road.
Mm-hmm.
So that was always nice. But, it's even nicer for the experience is places that you'd find that you hike in. So you find a trailhead, and typically the creeks would be running alongside of those trailheads.
How long did you spend in the mountains guiding?
6 years, 6 to 7 years. So I moved out there when I was 17, and almost immediately started a guide service. It started as friends and family, small word of mouth stuff, and it grew to, I kind of ended up figuring out that doing subcontract work was a really good way to get clients. So I started doing subcontract work with probably 5 different guide services in the Boone area. And, it was a blessing, man. I was blessed to stay busy.
And you were basically just for the people at home, they would overbook, and then they'd call you when they had too many clients.
Correct.
Okay.
So Boone is definitely a well-known fly fishing area. It's all due to the elevation. So all these guide services, they're busy. So whenever they need an extra guy, I'd be their guy.
That's cool. Yeah. That's cool. So and it probably took off at that point because they knew that they could trust that you were going to put people on fish.
Yeah, for sure. You build a reputation, There's definitely guys that don't last in the guide world. You'll see a fishing guide, saltwater or fresh. They'll be around for a couple years, and all of a sudden you don't hear from them anymore. But the guys that stick around are typically the guys that are consistently. Mm-hmm. And it's not all about catching fish either. I think a lot of time in the saltwater world, we focus on we have to catch 20 fish today. Mm-hmm. In the trout fly fishing world in the mountains, it's more about the experience and learning the art and enjoying the beautiful area instead of, catching 20 fish or 20 trout in that day.
That's one thing I have to tell myself sometimes.
Yeah, me too.
I remember just pulling around the flats. Like I had just built my platform. I had bought a $75 pole. Like I was getting into it.
Yeah.
And I was around Wrightsville Beach pulling around, and I remember the first time I ever saw a redfish in like 2 foot of water.
Yeah.
And I started panicking a little bit, like, and no chance of casting at it because I'm like, I got the pole in my hand. This fish is like chasing bait.
Yeah.
And I watched it for probably 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. I don't know where it went, but I'll never forget that moment. Mm-hmm. And that's what I have to tell myself is it's not about getting out there and catching 20 fish.
No.
If you can have those little experiences that stick with you, that goes way further than the fact that you may have caught 10 fish this day.
Yeah. I mean, I went out yesterday. We saw 1 fish in the grass. It was nice high tide at the end of the workday. We went out there just for a couple hours, and we saw 1 fish. I was happy with that. We got a chance to throw at it, didn't eat. But to me, seeing that fish in the grass, beautiful, glowing in the water, that's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm. You let's jump back. So you've guided for 6-7 years. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, there's a transition period, and Wilmington, North Carolina comes up.
Yeah.
What is the story there?
So the story is weather.
Yeah.
Boone had some pretty nasty weather in the winter. And I would say I'm the type of person, as well as my partner, we're both affected by the winter weather, and we were over it. It was so cold all the time, and unfortunately, we were just over being cold. Mm-hmm. So my family lived in Southport here, which is just south of us here in the Wilmington area, and it was ready to come home and be with family and enjoy some nice weather.
Yeah. Had you been doing any saltwater fishing previously to your time where you moved here?
For sure. So all my family are big fishermen. My mom's big in saltwater fishing. My dad's big in saltwater fishing. My cousin has a second home here where they offshore fish often. So given that I had that guide schedule, I could come down to the beach when I wanted to and come saltwater fishing. So I was pretty familiar with the salt.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit about it a second ago, but what would be your favorite fish to target here?
Redfish.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
There's nothing like a belly crawling or tailing redfish in 12 inches of water. There's nothing better than that on a fly rod.
Yeah.
In the Carolinas. There's other places in the world that you can target incredible fish on fly, but in the Carolinas, a redfish, that's just fun.
Yeah, they've eluded me on the fly rod. It's tough because a lot of times you need 2 people on the boat. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't fly fish, for people at home that are watching this that don't fly fish, if you're trying to pole your boat in shallow water, you have the wind that's going against you. You have the direction of the boat is hard to change. Say you do see fish, you're following fish, all of a sudden they move in a different direction. Mm-hmm. You not only do you have the issues of the boat, they're easy to spook. And then a lot of times, say you're in the perfect position where you've got to set this pole down, mm-hmm. you've got to get your rod up, you've got a false cast. Yeah. There's a lot to it.
There's a lot going on.
I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but everything has to line up in order to be able to do that alone.
I think it's really important to have two people on the boat and also have a buddy who knows how to pole. Now, we can talk about that all day of people knowing how to pole, but it's really important to get a couple buddies who are into it as much as you are and just go with them and switch off. Mm-hmm. You know, like I said, in the fly world, you catch one fish in a day. That's a good day. So not necessarily go fish for fish, but once you get tired of poling, definitely get someone to switch off with you. And, there's a lot going on. I try to pole by myself. I freak out. Mm-hmm. I drop the pole. I lost my pole in the marsh the other day. It's hard to do.
Yeah. You can spend a lot of time and not be successful before you get to that point where you're even capable of putting yourself in the right position. What type of gear are you running? Like if you have 6, 7, 8 years experience guiding, you have to have a brand that you prefer.
There is. So my favorite rods are Sage rods. I think they're perfect for saltwater because they typically run a little bit stiffer than some other name brands. Sage is definitely a premier brand. They just came out with a Sage. I believe it's called a R8.
Oh yeah,
it feels incredible. I just casted it the other day.
Did you buy one?
My buddy did.
Okay.
I'm gonna order one. Mm-hmm. But I was on the boat with my buddy. He had one and it was a game changer. So Sage rods are my favorite. It's also really important to use floating line, especially in this shallow water. For my mountain people, that's pretty uncommon. Typically, when we're in the mountains and we're throwing sinking line for bait fish patterns, but here in the shallow water, we're gonna use floating line to do that.
What grain? This is just for me, curiosity wise. What grain were you throwing in the mountains?
Typically like 250 grain.
Okay.
So pretty heavy stuff. Yeah. I preferred to throw a light fly, so not necessarily a super weighted fly, but I'd rather the line do the work for you than the fly. But here in the saltwater, you want quite the opposite. So typically, I'm using pretty big dumbbell eyes to get that to sink right in front of that redfish. I don't typically move that fly much either. We can get into some specifics if you want to, but I want that to sink right in front of them. I typically don't touch it. Mm-hmm. Let it sit. Let them feel like they found it.
Yeah.
And that's typically the key of getting them to eat that fly.
Yeah, and for the folks at home that aren't familiar with the fly, the lines, there's different types. There's the sink lines. There's the float lines. There's 1,000 different variations. A lot of the weighted lines I have, they are like weighted forward, so that they do sink faster. Mm-hmm. And I've found that in the ocean, I got to use that sink tip. Mm-hmm. And like you said, I'm throwing clousers that have a lot of weight on them. They're really hard to cast.
They are.
I mean, if you can get 30, 40, 50 yards, you're doing great. I mean,
yeah, no doubt. Especially, I find a lighter fly is way easier to cast. Now, in fly fishing, for the folks that don't fly fish, you're not casting in a traditional spinning rod sense. You're actually throwing the weight of the lure when you're spin fishing. But in fly fishing, you're actually throwing the weight of that line. If you're casting properly, you're throwing the line, not the fly or bait. So it's important to consider.
Yeah. So you like Sage rods. What's your go-to reel setups?
I like the Orvis Hydros. It's a mid-level. I don't find reels to be super important in the fly category. Typically, I don't find many fish, at least in the Carolinas, that you're really going to test that drag system with. So typically, it's just a line holder for me, really, and I'm fighting that fish on my finger instead of putting them on the rod or putting them on the reel.
Yeah, I've found the same thing. The only fish that takes me into backing is going to be the bonita.
Yeah, which is so fun.
Yeah. What size rod would you go for redfish?
Usually I use 8 to 9 weights. Mm-hmm. So in comparison, that would be, on a trout setup, I'd use it anywhere from a 3 to a 5 weight. But on a redfish, typically they fight much harder than any trout that I've ever felt. So 8 to 9 weights are typically will help you cast through that wind as well as fight that fish appropriately.
Have you got into speckled trout?
I haven't. I'm just redfish crazy.
Yeah.
I'm redfish crazy. I don't really care to catch a speckled trout. I mean, they're fun. I don't care to eat fish, I think so. A lot of people who like to eat fish love a speckled trout, but a redfish to me, that's pretty much all I target.
Mm-hmm. So you're all catch and release.
All catch and release. Yeah.
I got you. What types of patterns do you prefer for a redfish?
I can show you. I brought the handy box.
Sounds good.
I brought the handy box. So typically I'm using shrimp or crab flies, and that's dependent on where I'm fishing. So if I'm fishing what we call a flood tide, which there's certain tides that will flood the grass on certain numbers in our area, I'm typically going to use a crab. So for instance, let's see here, something like that. So something small. You can see that.
And what materials would that be?
So just for the EP fibers.
Okay.
EP fibers, and that's just a feather.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they call it a craft feather.
Mm-hmm.
So something like that. Typically in the grass, I find the reason why they're in the grass is they're trying to dig down in there and get the crabs that were previously dry, but now that's wet. So I find the crabs are. That's the way. Now, if I'm fishing like an oyster bank or during low tide, if they're just kind of cruising in a channel per se, I'll use a bait fish pattern or a shrimp pattern. This is one of my favorites here. It's used and abused.
That's how you know it works.
Yeah. So something small. Again, notice that I don't use tons of weight. I'd much rather let it sink. Don't move it too much, and just let it. Let the fly do the work instead of you.
Just for me, say you cast in front of a fish 5 feet, and are you noticing that the fish is going to strike when he sees it fall, or is it after it's already sitting there?
If the fish is really close to you, and you can tell that when a fish is going to spook. If the fish is about to spook, sometimes he'll eat it on the fall. But most of the time, let's say I make a 15 to 30 foot cast where they don't realize I'm there, typically they're going to eat it on the bottom. If you look at a redfish, their mouths are actually shaped slightly down. And that's because they're majority bottom feeders. So they're looking and scanning the bottom for what they're trying to eat. Crustaceans, mud crabs, fiddler crabs, anything that's sitting on the bottom.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I had that curious question.
Yeah.
What I see you have some shinies over here.
Some shiny. So the shiny stuff this is a multi-purpose box. I just got back from Weldon and about a month ago and was shad fishing. So that's a great way to introduce young anglers to fly fishing. It gives you lots of opportunity to have hookups on fly. So I could not recommend that enough to anybody. Take your kids shad fishing. Yeah. It's poor man's tarpon is what we call it.
Okay. Yeah. What about these right here?
There's spoon flies. There's nothing better for a redfish than a spoon. There's no secret. There's no secret that redfish like spoons. So this is a pretty dirty fly. I'm not proud of this one, but just a spoon fly is originally one of my buddies in Texas showed me this, and I went down there to go visit him. We were using spoon flies, and I was a believer.
Yeah. What's the material of that?
So I double it up. Mm-hmm. So it's really like I don't know the material. It's really just like a coated plastic.
Okay.
And then I put EV or UV resin on it, and I cook it on there, so it makes it kind of stiff. That way it flutters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that would be, when would you use that?
In the grass as well.
Okay.
I'd use it in the grass or sight casting.
Okay.
Yeah. My favorite color of fly, which I don't have represented in here, is a black fly.
Okay.
I find that many people, they try to, even in spin fishing or fly, they try to go with these crazy colors, big chartreuse or pinks. And I look at fly fishing as they want to eat something natural. You're really trying to match the hatch is a term that we use a lot in fly fishing. And typically in the water, a lot of things are dark colored, so browns or blacks. So something like that. That's a great redfish fly, trout fly, flounder. Anything will eat that.
You do you tie all your own?
I do, yeah.
What type of vise do you like?
It's a Renzetti.
Okay.
A Renzetti Traveler is what I use. tried and true. I've tied thousands of flies on it guiding. I would tie flies every single day when I was guiding, and she held up. So
yeah. What's your go-to website to order your materials, or do you have a few?
I don't. I typically would always shop local for tying material. I've acquired so much over the years of guiding that I don't really have to buy any more right now. But I would always recommend going to your local fly shop. If you're here in the Wilmington area, Sportsman Warehouse does have some fly tying material, but there's not many options in the Wilmington area to buy fly tying material.
A lot of folks here don't fly fish. Yeah. I guess we both would be in the small percentile of people that do it, but what would be your best advice for somebody that listens to this podcast and their interest is piqued? What would be step one?
Step one, practice in your yard. I think the biggest thing is wind, and I think that turns off a lot of people. They may go out on a day that is very windy day. It's hard to cast. The best thing to do is practice in your yard, driveway, public park. You don't need the most expensive fly rod. You don't need a $2,000 setup. Go to Walmart, get yourself a fly rod, and practice in the yard. That is the biggest thing I would say to people, because I think when they go out, especially in the saltwater, usually the conditions aren't great. We in the Carolinas, we have a couple days a month where we get low wind, and a lot of people work. So on those days, we can only go on certain days. So best thing I'd say is go practice that cast, because when you do go out on that bad day, it's going to turn you off if you can't cast that rod 3 feet in front of you. So just keep practicing in the yard.
You've probably heard this 1,000 times. I'll give you my story. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere. My neighbor had a pond, and he always let us go fishing out there. And I know that a lot of tried and true fly fishermen are going to hate this, but one of my favorite movies is A River Runs Through It.
I heard that every day of my life.
Exactly. I know, and that's why I knew that you were going to hate that. Even still, man, I love that movie. And as a kid, I watched that movie, and I wanted to do that. So I did exactly what you're talking about. I got like a 25 at the time. I think it was an Allen rod and reel combo.
Sweet.
Yeah, and I practiced out there in the yard. And I would go over there and catch little brim with a fly rod. And years went by. I ended up breaking the tip off of that rod. I put it down. I never touched it again. And then I got to Wilmington, and I started fishing pretty hard. And then the YouTube stuff started happening. And then I knew, okay, I started falling back into the idea of trying to catch fish on a fly rod. And I saw videos from David Mangum.
Yeah.
Shallow season.
Yeah.
It's one of and I'm going to link it in the description below. Probably the best redfish video I've ever seen.
Okay.
And I've seen his videos 10, 15 times. And I'll send them to friends. I'm like, watch this.
Yeah, this is the one.
It gets me jacked up to think about chasing a redfish on fly. I still haven't done it because
we're gonna do it.
I still haven't done it. I want to do it.
It is season right now. Yeah. So in the next 2 weeks, it should be prime redfish on fly season.
Yeah.
The water is just clean enough where you can see them, but it's not too clean where you're spooking them when you're too close. So it's primo right now.
Have you noticed a influx of reds yet? I know that we have this period where they school up, and then a lot of them will move out into the ocean, and then they start to trickle back in.
I think they're trickling back in. I'm seeing a lot of kind of summer trends right now in the Wilmington area. Probably about a month ago, they were definitely still schooled up in big 1,000+ redfish schools. I think they've now they've broken up and now are kind of in singles and doubles and triple pairs. So, yeah.
You think that gives you a better opportunity to actually land a fish versus
I do.
The big schools?
I think the schools get less beat up like that, or the redfish get less beat up. Typically, there's a decent amount of fishermen, especially in the Wrightsville Beach area. So when a fisherman finds a school, they're not going to forget about that. They're going to go back, and they're going to go back, and they're going to go back, which I don't recommend doing. I recommend finding new fish to keep those fish healthy. Yeah. But it's just natural. You want to go out fishing and you want to catch something. So I get that too. But now that they're broken up, I think is a lot higher chance of actually catching them instead of finding them in those schools, because those schools, they get beat up and spooked and they're not happy.
Yeah. How long have you been chasing these fish here in the Wilmington area?
About a year. Actively. Like I said, I've been coming down here my whole life, family with boats, always been in love with the redfish for sure, but actively on a daily basis, I'm probably fishing 5 days a week right now after work. About a year.
If someone is new into chasing fish on the fly rod, what, and let's just say for redfish in general, what would be the tide that you would start?
Low tide. High tide, I find it very hard for them to find. You have to have a very specific kind of boat to push in the grass. Not everyone has a poling skiff. So low tide in certain areas, you got to be really careful not to get stuck in this area. But in certain areas, I think fish are much easier to find at low tide. You'll see them tailing in certain areas here. You'll see them what we call belly crawling, which is when they're in such shallow water, they're just pushing themselves in that mud. But low tide is typically, I find, much easier to find fish.
What kind of boat are you fishing?
It's a Mitzi skiff. It's a North Carolina-made poling skiff. It's not too fancy, but it pushes me around, and it's really nice to pull, really easy to pull. So it's been really fun to get up in the grass with it and look for those fish.
What size motor are you running?
It's only 40 horse. Yeah, she doesn't fly or anything, but it gets us to where we need to go. You see a lot of guys with $80,000 flats boats and ripping the bottom off of them. That's not for me. I'll stick with my cheap boat, even though it's not cheap at all, but cheap boat, and it catches fish just fine.
That was the point I was trying to make. Is does someone have to get out there and spend $60,000 on a used Maverick?
No, I started on a single wide canoe.
Okay.
You do not need. John boats are fantastic. I've caught more fish on John boats than I've caught on $100,000 poling skiffs. You do not need all that fancy stuff. I recommend Walmart rods to start and John boats. That's the way. You do not need this fancy stuff. I said sage rods. You don't need that. That's if you're into it.
I have a question on that. Yeah. So you've let's say you've upgraded from the Walmart rod. You're ready to get an intermediate style. What would be you tell me what would be a good.
Yeah, so I love Redington products for that. Redington, they have a great entry to mid-level price point. You can get a fantastic setup for under $300, and that will last you a lifetime if you wanted it to. Mm-hmm. So they come. I would recommend piecing them together instead of buying a combo kit. The combos, they typically don't have the nicest reels. They don't have the nicest line. The fly line is the most important part of a fly rod setup. So get a nice line, a cheap reel, and a middle of the road rod from Redington.
What kind of line do you prefer, since you do believe that that's the best?
I like Airflow Tropical Punch. It is just cast great.
Mm-hmm. Have I missed anything that
I didn't think, yeah,
that people would need to know if they were interested in getting into redfish on the fly rod?
Definitely with any saltwater, you need a push pull if you want to fly fish. Typically, a trolling motor does get in the way of when you're casting or your line gets wrapped up in the prop of the trolling motor. Mm-hmm. I definitely recommend poling rather than using the trolling motor. That also, it's almost a spiritual adventure or primitive, should I say, adventure. When you're pulling that flat, just you feel like you're truly one with nature.
Yeah, it's silent too.
It's silent.
The only noise you make is when you hit oysters.
Yep, I hit a lot. You will hit a lot. So, get that John boat out there. Don't you're gonna, especially going in low tide in the Carolinas, pretty much from Virginia Beach to Jacksonville, Florida. All the water is relatively similar, and we got oysters. And you're gonna spare some gel coat for the redfish gods.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about was your career. You've moved to Wilmington, and I want you to tell everybody what you do.
Yeah, so I do boat and yacht insurance as well as guide insurance. Given my background, I typically get along with the guides pretty well, so I like to go after the guides. But if you need any kind of boat or yacht insurance, we're right here in Wrightsville Beach. It's called Maritime Insurance International. Put the links below. And we'll hook you up.
Yeah. I've been talking with Mike for a while now, and he's a great dude. So thanks, for sure, if you don't have boat insurance, it's not that expensive.
No,
and it's totally worth it, because all it takes is one mistake, and maybe not even your mistake.
Correct.
Someone else is what you're buying your insurance
Typically, I'm seeing claims from not not the operators, it's someone else hitting them, or God forbid, you don't want something to happen to somebody or somebody get hurt. That's the worst thing imaginable. You got to make sure you're taken care of.
And that's not even including the weather that we have here. So there's a lot of reasons why you should have boat insurance.
Yes.
And before I go, of course, if I can help you out with any real estate needs, I have my contact information down below. And Mike, thanks so much for coming on, man. It was a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure.
All
Thanks,
right.
Eric.
Yep.
Thanks.